Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's episode of Learn with Lorna, episode number 221, where we're looking at the subject of forests and forestry. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Invess, Wick, Fort William and Portree. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then as always, we are very, very grateful for that. And it's one of those sentences that, you get in the habit of saying, but it doesn't mean I mean it any less any week. So thank you for those of you who have donated to us. It makes a huge difference. So as I say, welcome to episode number 221, Forests and Forestry. It's a subject that has generated a very heated discussion over the centuries. So let's start with an overview of Scotland's early story of woodland and forestry from Nature Scotland's Nature Agency. After the retreat of the ice some 11,000 years ago, Britain was colonised first by boreal species and later by more temperate vegetation. Birch was the first dominant tree, followed by hazel, pine and oak. Woodland cover around 5,000 years ago reached Shetland and the Western Isles. Woodland cover then began to decline, largely due to early agriculture. By the time the Roman legions of Agricola invaded Scotland in AD 82, at least half of our natural woodland had gone. Much of it was replaced by peatland, partly as a result of the cooler, wetter climate and partly because of human activities. In the 17th and 18th centuries, many of the remaining woods were heavily exploited for timber, charcoal and tan bark, but this probably also secured their continued existence. By the 19th century, interest in native woods was in decline. By 1900, woodlands covered only 5% of Scotland's land area, as many small and isolated blocks. This led to the loss of species requiring larger unbroken blocks of native woodland, especially larger mammals and predators. General Roy compiled the Military Survey of Scotland around 1750, which lets us verify the continuity of woodland cover at that time across Scotland. Major land use changes occurred after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, including the clearances, the switch from cattle-based to sheep-based economy, rapid increase in commercial plantations, development of large shooting estates, with, by the mid-20th century, an expanding deer population. And incidentally, in Scotland, ancient woodland is defined as land that is currently wooded and has been continually wooded since at least 1750. Ordnance Survey first edition maps produced in the mid-19th century show much more woodland. The number of plantations grew in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and so did the extent of what appears to be semi-natural woodland. This growth reflects lapses on the part of the Roy surveyors, as well as genuine increases in woodland cover. Almost all of our remaining fragments of native woodland have at some time been modified by man's activities. Traces of all of these actions can be viewed in the surviving woodland. For example, the history of plantation in Scotland goes back to the 18th century, although there was little real development until the 20th century. But every wood has its own history about its trees, its ecosystems, and the people who have used and managed that wood. So some really interesting points there to pick up from that Nature Scot extract. Firstly, the link between mapping and telling the story of Scotland's woodlands. I found that really interesting when I was reading that extract. The use of Roy's 1750 map and the first edition Ordnance Survey maps to trace the growth and decline of woodland coverage. I have spoken many times over the last 5 years in this series about maps and their many uses, and I often use them to visualise the growth or decline of an area, but of course they can also illustrate the same for woodland. Now Roy's, as that extract suggested, is much less accurate. It's a much kind of larger scale map, but it certainly gives an idea of where forests could be found. When we come on to the first edition, second edition and subsequent Ordnance Survey maps, we get much more precise picture. Another thing I wanted to pull from that extract is the tie between global and national events and the amount of woodland coverage that we have. The decisions that were made after the Battle of Culloden the changes to land use, the subsequent clearances, the changes to farming techniques and agricultural practices, all of that ties into what woodland survives, what areas have been replanted, and what that timber has been used for. It's absolutely intrinsically linked to that story. In Lochaber Archives, we hold, within the West Highland Museum Archive collection, a really good example that shows the interaction between the Jacobites and the story of Highland timber. A document from 1692 that shows the money paid out by Colonel John Hill, commander of the fort at Fort William, for maintaining the fort and garrison. And it reads like this. So again, 1690s. The accounts for money laid out by me for the use of the garrison of Fort William. Paid for boards and iron by Major General Mackay's orders in July 1690, £36. May the 14th, 1691, paid Mr. Davidson for fir and ash trees. June the 12th, 1691, to the tutor of Appin for 185 fir trees at 20 pence per tree. To the tutor of Appin for 167 fir trees at the same rate. To the said tutor for 22 fir trees. To Robert Mackay for 77 and 5 deal boards. To Robert Mackay for 400 deal boards. Paid the tutor of Appin for 400 fir trees. Paid Mr. Davidson for large fir and ash trees. Paid money for candles for the guards and horsemen, for pitch and for tar. I didn't read out all the amounts there, but they all have amounts alongside them. And when Rory in our Lochaber archive sent me that document over, he added that the tutor of Appin at that time, the one mentioned in those documents, would have been Stuart of Ardshiel, who was at the time acting as the tutor or the guardian for the chief of the clan Appin Stuart, who was at that time still a minor. And as that list of expenses shows, at the time where there was no direct fighting with the Jacobite-leaning clans, like that one, like Stuart of Appin, then they would have been doing business with the fort, which is just an interesting aside. But even there you can see the importance of timber in maintaining infrastructure and in maintaining the garrison. And I'll come back to the impact of war on forestry several times throughout this episode. But to pick up on one final thing from that Nature Scot extract that I read at the beginning, it noted that the history of plantation in Scotland goes back to the 18th century, and that's what I want to touch on next. We see this echoed both in our own collections and also in the statistical accounts. In the Baillie of Dinane collection that we hold at the Highland Archive Centre, a 1777 letter from Alexander Godsman to Colonel Baillie of Dinane, who was then in Madras, gives a huge amount of detail about the improvements that were being carried out on the Dinane estate, and the letter includes this section. The fir planting in the Craig continues to thrive pretty well, at least the side next to the town. The other side, next to the Aird, is not in such a thriving state, as the plants that were put in came from Aberdeen, and many of them having got heat aboard the ship, which is almost impossible to prevent, has occasioned a great many of them to have to go back. I wrote you formally that we had laid down a part of the garden with fir seeds that we may have it in our power to supply any vacancies that happen, or for planting some more ground as far as they will go. This last spring I planted out about 300 ashes in the garden on the east and west side of the burn that comes down close by the road. They are of different heights, from 3 to 8 feet, and they seem to thrive extremely well. So just really interesting there that not only are they planting trees, but they're using the gardens to plant seed so that if trees fail, they can restock their own plantations. And if we have a look through the statistical accounts, it absolutely confirms this, and I want to share 3 different extracts with you. I was completely astonished, although I knew this, when I looked at the statistical accounts, just how much evidence there is of mass plantation in the late 1700s. The first extract that I want to read is from the Inverness statistical account of 1793, and it reflects on the exact same estate that was being talked about in that letter. There are no natural woods in this parish if we accept an inconsiderable oak wood which is periodically cut for bark, but this defect is amply compensated by the extensive plantations with which the parish abounds. In the extremity of the parish eastward on the estate of Culloden, there is a plantation of Scotch firs and forest trees of considerable extent. This plantation was completed above 70 years ago. It is of great advantage to the proprietor and will undoubtedly be of still greater. The plantations on the estate of Kinmiley's in the western extremity of the parish were begun about 35 years ago and completed in a few years. On this estate, every acre that was not capable of being improved to arable land was planted. Others followed this example. One gentleman in particular, who kept an exact account of his operations, planted 15,000 forest trees of the following kinds: elm, ash, beech, oak and sycamore, and 4 million Scotch firs, which occupy a space of 800 acres of Denane, one of the Dromalbin range of mountains. In short, on the face of this range to the east and as far to the property of this gentleman extends to the west, with the exception of what was fit for arable land and the oakwood formerly mentioned, from Loch Ness northward to the Bewley Firth, an extent of 6 miles, is covered with thriving plantations. Besides this, there are several other plantations, all in a thriving state. This business is still going on with little remission, so that in a few years it is likely that there will not be a single useless acre in this parish. So that's Inverness. But we can also see it echoed across multiple statistical accounts. This is Kiltarlity from 1794. Major Fraser of Belladrum has upon his estate valuable plantations of forest trees of all kinds: oak, ash, elm, beech, plane trees, poplars of various kinds, mountain ash, maples and service trees, also larks, spruce, silver fir, New England pine and the common Scotch fir, besides a number of other trees and shrubs for ornament near his house and gardens, all planted within these 30 years. The Honourable Archibald Fraser of Lovat has also planted a great variety of forest trees since he resided in this country. He has at present a valuable nursery consisting of many hundreds of thousands of forest trees which he means soon to transplant. Colonel Fraser of Bruach has also planted some 1,000 forest trees about his farm, which are at present a great ornament to this part of the country, and will in the process of time, when they grow up, be a valuable acquisition to the proprietor. And then the last one I want to share with you, particularly just because of the last sentence of it, is Kilturn from 1791. The gentlemen's houses here are large and commodious, and their gardens well stocked with fruit trees. About 80 years ago, there were few forest trees to be seen here, except some natural elders and willows on the banks of the rivers, and a few ashes, elms and limes surrounding gentlemen's gardens. But now there are extensive plantations of firs or pines, miles in circumference, besides many thousands of oaks and other hardwood of every kind that is to be met with in North Britain. The several proprietors seem to vie with each other in raising the finest plantations of timber. Such improvements are desirable on a double account. They adorn the face of the country while they promote the interests of individuals. I just thought that I didn't want to cut any of those three out really, because they paint such a vivid picture, particularly reading them all together, paint such a vivid picture of redevelopment and planting on a massive scale. And that sits within a raft of improvement activities such as clearing people off land, enclosing fields, setting up sheep and deer farms, all of which were very controversial at the time and all of which continue to be very contested. So what was the drive at this time for this huge growth in plantations? Why were so many events, so many estates doing this? Why were so many trying to completely change the look and of the landscape? Well, it's partly fashionable, as that last sentence indicated. There's something about the aesthetic of it, something about these landowners being able to control the landscapes that they own and make them decorative and attractive. There's also a driving need for timber. There's a market for timber out with the Highlands, and wherever there's a market, there's money. But how do you get timber out of the Highlands in the 1700s? We hold at the Highland Archive Centre a 1742 contract which sheds light on this. Copy of a wood contract 1742. This document is a copy of a contract from 1742 between Simon, Lord Fraser of Lovat, and John Neilson of Corsock in Galloway and John Sumas of Preston. Roderick Chisholm of Comer had arranged the sale of 50,000 fir trees from his lands in Kilmorich to some gentlemen in the north of England, and Nielsen and Sumas were tasked with undertaking this transportation. It was thought that the most feasible course to get the timber from the uplands to a port on the coast was by floating the timber down the River Beauly, and therefore permission had to be granted by Lord Lovat for both the freedom of the river and also the construction of timber yards and sawmills along the way, as well as paying him £2,500 sterling over 10 years. The various people involved in that contract went on to have varying fates. One went to America. Lord Lovat, of course, was executed. He is the Lovat of the 45. But the contract, before any of that happened, really had come to nothing, because after attempting to float 300 of the trees downriver, the buyers declared it completely impracticable and called off the entire operation, much to the frustration of Roderick Chisholm. Now, as to why they were doing this at this time, that's 1740s, that's slightly early for the Industrial Revolution, but that would go on to become a major reason for the shipping of timber out of the Highlands to fire the furnaces of the northeast of England and the Midlands industries. We can also find evidence of that within Alexander Fraser timber merchants, of the huge amounts of timber being shipped out. And again, the Industrial Revolution, something else that has a very contested history. What's interesting as we go through this story is the constant presence of the Frasers of Lovat. So that 1742 document he appears in, as I say, the Lovat of the 45, the Old Fox, because he allows at that point the construction of sawmills and timber yards on his estate. Then, two Lovat chiefs later, Archibald Fraser of Lovat was named in that statistical account as planting hundreds of thousands of trees on the Lovat estates. And if we move to the second statistical account of Kiltarlity, 1845, we again find Chisholm of Comer and Lovat, who both have land in that area. We find the latest Lord Lovat and Chisholm name-checked there for the trees that they have on their land. The second statistical account of 1845 for Kiltarlity says about the Chisholm lands, notes that beside a very considerable quantity of natural timber, there have been around 1,000 acres planted with larch, oak, ash, elm, beech, plane, Scotch fir, chestnut, etc. And all of this within the last 24 years. So that is not the same that's being talked about in the first statistical account. This is a whole other range of plantation that has happened in the 1800s. Lovat, in that same account, is noted to have planted numerous evergreen species on the Lovat estates. And if we carry on through the Kiltarlity second statistical account of 1845, we find this section that's not about any one particular landowner, but just gives an overview of the state of woodland in the parish. Strathglass of old was mostly altogether covered with wood, which, with the exception of one forest on the property of Goosegan, but few living remains now exist throughout the parish, though traces of it are everywhere to be met within the peat mosses, where the poorer peasantry dig up great numbers of trunks, which, being very resinous, afford them a cheap and tolerably good light during the long winter evenings. Some of the old firs in the forest are immensely large, being between 60 and 70 feet in height and 16 feet in girth. The Protector Cromwell used a great quantity of timber from Strathglass in the construction of his fortifications at Inverness, and in fact until within late years wood was the only article transported from this parish, many parts of which, owing to the gravelly nature of the soil, seem particularly adapted for its growth. Larch thrives amazingly, and it is not uncommon to find specimens of this valuable wood, which at 40 years of age measure 30 feet, and at 15 years of age measure 12 cubic feet. A blemish is rarely to be found in this kind of timber. It goes on to describe the different other types of timber, how much they're worth. So, for instance, he says natural fir fetches the rate of 1 shilling and sixpence per cubic foot when manufactured. Talks about the use of birch for barrel staves, which fetches £4 4 shillings per thousand. And then concludes, the common Scotch fir is not planted so much as formerly, the preference now being decidedly in favour of larch, not only as more marketable but of quicker growth. There are many new plantations in the parish, and the different heritors of late years pay much more attention than they were wont to do previously to periodically and regular thinnings, being convinced that the value of their wood is much increased by this process. So, again there, evidence of the constant connection between war and fortifications and timber, that reference there to Oliver Cromwell building the fort in Inverness. But also that final couple of sentences, that they don't grow fir as much anymore, they grow larch because it's quicker. And the fact that they are changing the way they manage the forest, the planted forest, by thinning out to improve the quality of the trees. All of that will become relevant as we go forward. And that reference to the value of the trees, we see this echoed in other types of document from the time as well. So for instance, we have court papers where people are charged with damaging trees because it's a cost to an estate. Or an 1857 letter held at Highland Archive Centre in which Andrew Belford, who was factor to the Lochiel estates, writes to Lochiel to discuss gaining compensation from the government after an excise man smoking his pipe burnt down a portion of Erich woods. So we see that the value of the woods matters to the estate. In our Munro of Navarre collection, we hold the Forester's letter books, and those again detail not only the planting of trees but the sale and the use of the timber. Just a quick flick through these Forester's letter books shows the vast amounts of timber being sold across the UK in the late 1800s. But I want to finish in the 20th century, when the urgent need for timber for the war effort in World War I led to the Highlands becoming a base for multiple forestry camps, men coming particularly from Canada in forestry corps to cut and work the timber. And the same would go on to happen in World War II, and I'm sure that many, Fiona Newton certainly, I'm sure you will be familiar with the forestry corps in the Highlands, I'm sure others will as well. The war took its toll on Britain's tree coverage, so not only did it shape Highland communities and lead to relationships and all sorts of things when the forestry corps were over from Canada and elsewhere, but the effect of this was that the countryside had a huge toll taken on it. Now, Lord Lovat of the Lovat Scouts, had been interested in forestry for decades, and in 1917 he was made responsible for the procurement of timber for the British Army in France. I read that he was, at one point during the First World War, he directed 63 Canadian forestry companies, 11 Royal Engineers units, and about 45,000 men, all in the production of timber. He was a driving force behind the afforestation of Britain after World War I. So again, when I say that, interesting that the Lovat Frasers come all the way through this story. And when the Forestry Commission was established in 1919, Lord Lovat was appointed its first chairman. He stayed on in the role until 1927. Let's return to Nature Scot. A defining feature of Scotland's woodlands has been the decline in woodland cover to an all-time low following the First World War. In 1919, Lloyd George said that Britain had nearly lost the war for the want of timber more than anything else. The Forestry Commission was created in the same year, with the main aim of preventing such a strategic weakness from ever arising again. The Forestry Commission set to work in Scotland over the next 40 years to create a home timber supply. In 1900, only about 5% of Scotland's land area was wooded, but by the early 21st century, large-scale afforestation had increased this figure to about 17%. And we hold documents in Nucleus that advocate forestry as a career in the 1940s. They describe all the different roles, trying to encourage people to join the forestry work. So for instance, the forestry worker forms the backbone of the whole service. He must be qualified to carry out the practical work required in the woods. The ganger is the leading workman in a gang of workers. The foreman is either in charge of a small area of woods or is employed in a larger forest under a forester. His job is to supervise all the work which goes on in the woods under his charge, and this calls for initiative, a strong sense of responsibility, and a good knowledge of forest techniques. The forester is in charge of a large woodland area or forest, and his post is a key one. He must be fully trained, intelligent, and have capacity for handling men. His is no light task, and to be successful he must bring to his duties a highly developed forest sense. The forest officer is responsible for the woods and forest over a considerable area, and he must be highly trained in silviculture and management. He must be self-reliant and have the qualities of leadership in his makeup. And it certainly was a career that many took on, and many of them who did have very fond memories of it. It's captured in many books and memoirs, including these volumes here, which are all about the Forestry Commission, the history of forestry plantations in the Highlands, and the stories of those who worked on them. But, as Nature Scott would go on to say at the end of that paragraph, the rapid expansion of forestry cover has had some well-publicised negative effects. And that is certainly the case, and we have many records about the well-publicised negative effects. From publications such as 1971's The Case for Forestry, in support, to 1986's The Theft of the Hills, very much against, as well as letters which detail issues faced by individual estates. In Nucleus, we hold a Forestry Commission article entitled Forestry Development in Caithness, which details experiments that have been undertaken and also details the benefits of forestry. So, for instance, it has a section that reads, "It is becoming more and more recognised that tree planting in Caithness would confer important benefits in making poor hill land productive, provide rural employment, and eventually the raw materials for wood-based industries. In addition, the strategic use of tree shelter in the form of shelter blocks and shelter belts could transform the wind climate for stock rearing in these parts of the country where natural hill relief is lacking." So, some positives around what forestry could bring to Caithness. But 1986's publication, The Theft of the Hills, brooks absolutely no argument about this. It reads in one section, "Nearly 90% of all the afforestation in Britain takes place in Scotland, and the area under coniferous plantations has increased by 750 square miles, nearly 500,000 acres in the last 10 years. It's not just the affront to man's finer senses which makes this deplorable. A fragile inheritance of wild land, the last great reserve of wildlife and semi-natural vegetation, is being frittered away by massive and misguided subsidies from the public purse. Most Scottish afforestation is now carried out by the wealthy, absentee and generally English clients of the private afforestation companies. They were responsible for 95% of the activity in the afforestation market in 1985 and used the Scottish hills as a lucrative tax haven. An unimaginative and inadequate forestry policy has allowed more than 99% of recent plantations to be composed of conifers, mainly Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine, which have been introduced from North America. Such monocultures of alien species are a recipe for the pest problems which have begun to occur in northern Scotland, where plantations have had to be sprayed with insecticide." So, as you can see, a very controversial subject, and as I say, historically and still, about how we manage our land. But it's interesting to see that within our collections we hold both passionate arguments for the work of the Forestry Commission in those early years, and then also arguments against. But I wanted to come back to finish with Nature Scott, because that extract I just read from that anti-plantation paper from 1986, things have changed since then. So I want to finish with this extract from Nature Scott. "Forests have been planned with much greater sensitivity since the mid-1980s, with expansion aimed at a much broader set of objectives, from biodiversity and landscape to recreation and rural development. The result has been a dramatic move from timber plantations to more diverse tree cover with multiple benefits. The last decade has seen the proportion of native species being established rise rapidly. Even so, many native woods remain small and isolated, and this limits their ability to support woodland biodiversity or produce other benefits such as timber. In the face of future environmental change, we need to make native woodlands resilient to the threats that they face. There are a range of actions that may increase resilience, and it is likely that different resilience actions will be required in different areas and different woodland types. So it's a fascinating story, and it's one which starts thousands of years ago but is intertwined with stories of land management, clearance, biodiversity, livestock, animals, clearances of people, wars, and so many other things. Scotland's forestry is now managed by Forestry and Land Scotland, who continue to grow trees for timber, but also for the benefit of wildlife, for human enjoyment of woodland as well. It was another interesting episode to write, so I hope that you have enjoyed it. And I hope you can join me next week, where we'll be looking at stories of pupils, something completely different from within our school files. And even in the conversations I've had with a couple of my colleagues in the different offices, I already think that's going to be a very fun episode. So I hope that you can join me next week, and I hope that you found this episode of interest. A reminder that this series is brought to you by Highland Highland at no cost to the viewer. Highland Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna series. But if you're able to join me next week, then that would be appreciated. If you're able to donate towards our work, then that too would be appreciated. Thank you very much.